Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're heading deep into the medieval Islamic West, Al-Andalus, the southern Iberian Peninsula. And we're trying to figure out why the mystics there, in Cordoba, were so radically different from their Eastern counterparts. We've got a dense stack of sources here.
And we have to tackle the language right away.
Terminology.
Exactly. When we talk about this tradition, we often just use this blanket term, Sufism.
Right.
But that word is, it's a simplification. Sometimes it's a distortion, really, because it just lumps together these incredibly varied movements. Our mission today is to pull that apart and show you that the mysticism that emerged in Al-Andalus was, for centuries, a fully distinct, highly speculative and parallel tradition.
Absolutely. And Al-Andalus wasn't just wealthy, it was an intellectual forge. I mean, we're talking about a civilization that produced legendary scholars and philosophers, people like Ibn Rushd, Ibn Tufayl, Ibn Hazm, all based in these incredible cities like Cordoba and Seville. This was a place where Greek philosophical texts were being translated and debated. It seems like an environment that would naturally foster a unique, more intellectual kind of spirituality.
That intellectual environment is absolutely key. What we later came to recognize as Western Sufism, exemplified by figures like the monumental Ibn Arabi. It was born out of a different spiritual impulse. Classical Eastern Sufism focused so intensely on internal psychology, on ethical practice. The tradition here in the West was immediately more interested in cosmology and abstract metaphysics.
So let's try to define that Eastern tradition first then, the one that serves as our baseline. What did classical Tasawwuf actually look like when it was concentrated further east?
Well, classical Tasawwuf was centered in the central Islamic lands, particularly Baghdad, with masters like Junaid. It was fundamentally a movement focused on purification, on ethics, and deep renunciant practices.
Right.
The whole goal was rigorous self-discipline to navigate a very clear, ordered spiritual path through different stations, the maqams, all to achieve intimacy with God.
And they had a very precise, almost technical vocabulary for all this interior work.
Yes, they absolutely needed it. To describe these deeply personal, transformative states, they use terms like marifa.
Which is like a Gnostic or intuitive knowledge.
Exactly. But perhaps the most famous is fana.
Fana. How should we really understand that term? Because you often just see it translated as annihilation.
It's so much more profound than simple annihilation.
Yeah.
It's the dissolution of the egoic self, the temporal self.
Okay.
The self has to be annihilated as a barrier so that the mystic can properly perceive reality. You destroy the false self in order to realize the true reality, which is, well, it's union with or pure perception of the divine. That rigorous path, defined by personal ethics and self-purification, that was the hallmark of the Eastern tradition.
And here's where we pivot to the West, because even though the foundational texts of Eastern Sufism eventually made their way to Al-Andalus, the local tradition had already begun developing on its own along a parallel intellectual track. They weren't looking inward first, they were looking outward.
It's exactly right. The Western movement took inspiration from the Quran and the Hadith, of course, but it was so heavily infused with the kind of intellectual material that was just readily available in Al-Andalus.
Neoplatonism.
Neoplatonism, speculative thought, may be influenced by groups like the Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity. This blend gave Western mysticism a speculative, almost cosmological starting point.
So to find the true origin of this highly speculative movement, we have to start with the mountain dweller himself. Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Jabili, better known as Ibn Masarra, born in Cordoba in 883.
Masarra is the foundational figure of the Al-Mutabirun, the contemplators. He started with a standard religious education, studying Maliki law, but his curiosity just chicked. It propelled him eastward. He spent time in Cairo, Tunisia, Mecca.
And it's during these travels that he might have run into both Eastern Sufis and these philosophical groups.
That's the theory. He may have encountered them directly, but he didn't stay on the Pilgrim Trail. He came back to Al-Andalus, retreated to the mountains outside Cordoba, and gathered his disciples, the Al-Mazariya.
Hence his nickname, Al-Jabali, the mountain dweller. But his ideas, they quickly landed him in some very deep trouble.
Troubled is an understatement. Even during his lifetime, he was seen as a radical threat by the established Maliki jurists, by the ruling elite. The accusations against him were severe. They often centered on the charge that he was teaching esoteric knowledge that was only for a select few.
Which would undermine the supremacy of the traditional legal scholars.
Precisely. He was accused of teaching that people could attain prophecy, which That sounds like an extreme charge.
Yeah, it does.
Scholars believe that was likely a hostile simplification of what he's actually saying. The real danger wasn't a claim to prophecy, but a claim to a kind of direct Gnostic knowledge.
Marifa.
Marifa, yes, gained outside the traditional legal framework. If you claim you can achieve truth through personal, esoteric contemplation, you are implicitly challenging the authority of the jurists.
Okay, that explains the reaction. So after his death in 931, the opposition was so successful that his actual writings, they were officially ordered burned. They tried to erase him.
And yet, his core concept survived, and it became central to the entire Western mystical lineage. That concept is itibar, contemplation.
Itibar.
The word is related to ibra, which means crossing over. For Masarra and his followers, itibar was the spiritual method for crossing over from the physical, temporal world to the direct experience of the divine.
So if the Eastern path involved intense internal ethics to dissolve the ego, how did the Western path of itibar, this crossing over, how did that actually work in practice?
It was a structured path of ascent, and it was deeply Neoplatonic in nature. Instead of starting with the soul, you start by contemplating nature itself. Masarra presented the world around us as the cosmic Quran, the Quran al-Takwini.
A sacred scripture whose letters are God's speech.
Exactly. The universe is a book written by God, and every element, every mountain, every star, every tree is a sign, an ayah, pointing directly to the Creator. You are meant to read this book.
So the physical world is a ladder.
It is a ladder. You ascend from contemplating the physical world, then through the planetary spheres, then to the soul, and then the intellect.
And what happens at the top rung of that ladder?
The climax of this ascent is reaching the contemplation of God as the ultimate source of all things, but within yourself. You use the outside world, the cosmology, as the means to achieve the ultimate inner realization.
So you find God by contemplating his creation.
You find your Lord and Creator by contemplating his manifestation in the cosmos. And that cosmological starting point, that is the revolutionary difference.
That is a fundamental distinction. So this tradition didn't just vanish when Masarra's books were burned. It must have gone underground, persisting through the Al-Mutabirun and then re-emerging in the 12th century.
That continuity brings us to our next crucial figure, Ibn Barrajan of Seville, a scholar and mystic who lived in the 12th century. And Barrajan really represents the maturing of this speculative tradition.
Now, Barrajan was aware of Eastern Sufism, but he insisted on keeping the Mutabirin tradition distinct, right? What was his big contribution here?
He was a true synthesizer. He incorporated spiritual practices that were common to Sufism like Dhikr, the repetition of God's names, and structured spiritual retreats. But he vehemently refused to abandon intellectual inquiry.
So he wasn't just an ascetic.
Not at all. He was known for studying the science of the ancients, geometry, logic, mathematics, astronomy.
That focus on science and logic is fascinating for a mystic. I understand he was pretty critical of others, too.
He was. He saw many contemporary renunciants in Seville as having fallen into this kind of anti-intellectualism and excessive asceticism. He believed it alienated them from true knowledge.
I see.
So Barrajan sought harmony, a balance between mystical unveiling and intellectual pursuit. To fully practice the itibar of his predecessor, Masarra, he actually moved out of Seville, became a farmer, a teacher in the countryside, just to be closer to nature.
He was literally living the idea of the cosmic Quran, and he formalized it, didn't he, into his framework of the three modes of revelation, the three Quran.
That's right. He gave Masarra's concept a structured cosmological framework. So the first mode is Masarra's idea, the creation itself, the universe, which he called the cosmic Quran, or Quran al-Takwini. The second mode is the traditional transmitted scripture, the written Quran, al-Quran al-Tadwini.
So hold on. Barrajan saying the universe is a source of divine knowledge that's equal in stature to the written scripture.
Yes.
That feels like a profoundly revolutionary move for the religious landscape of that time.
It is revolutionary. He's equating nature and scripture as dual primary sources of God's revelation. And then he adds the third most intimate mode, the human being itself.
The self.
The human self, the soul, acts as a microcosm, a comprehensive mirror that contains the whole of revelation. All three modes, cosmos, scripture, and self, they have to be studied and cross-referenced to reach the divine.
So if the universe is a cosmic mirror, the human is a miniature version of that mirror. That's a powerful philosophical basis. And you can see a direct, blazing path from these ideas straight to the next generation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If we connect Barrajan's ideas to the wider picture, we see he really laid the philosophical groundwork for Ibn Arabi, For example, Barrajan conceptualized what he called the universal servant, the first thing God creates, an intermediary substance or being between God and the rest of creation.
Which immediately brings to mind the philosophical traditions that influence the region, like
Huh.
Neoplatonism.
Exactly. It functions a lot like the Neoplatonic nous or world intellect. But more importantly, it is the direct precursor to Ibn Arabi's cornerstone doctrine of al-insan al-kamil,
The perfect man.
the perfect man. This is not a concept that just sprung fully formed from Ibn Arabi. It matured over centuries in Al-Andalus, starting with the Barrajan and the Mutabirun.
What other threads did Barrajan weave that Ibn Arabi later picked up?
Two major ones. First, his concept of mythali, or imaginal existence, which describes a realm that's neither purely spiritual nor purely physical. It's the vehicle through which spiritual realities manifest to our consciousness. And second, his deep interest in the science of Arabic letters, believing the inherent structure and sounds of the language held cosmological secrets. These highly theoretical metaphysical doctrines became the very core of Ibn Arabi's philosophy.
That sets the stage perfectly for the ultimate convergence that happens in the 12th and 13th centuries. Suddenly, the region is just full of mystical activity, with three distinct streams that are about to crash into each other.
Precisely. By the late 12th century, you have the established speculative al-Mutabirun tradition running parallel to everyone else. Then you have a flourishing local renunciant tradition focused on personal ethics, charity, self-inquiry, partly influenced by Eastern manuals like those from Al-Muhasibi,
And then the third stream is the formal, self-conscious adoption of Eastern Sufism.
which is brought to the West primarily by a man named Abu Madian. Originally from Seville, he operated mostly in the Maghreb. By his time, the established Eastern Sufi masterpieces Al-Ghazali's works, Al-Qushayri's Risala, they had finally permeated the West. Abu Mahdi was the master who absorbed these works, synthesized them with local practices, and formally introduced and institutionalized proper Sufism, paving the way for the influential Shadhili Sufi order.
So when Ibn Arabi and his contemporaries are growing up, they are immersed in this heady mix. You've got the deep cosmology of the Mutabirun, the ethical rigor of the renunciant groups, and the formalized spiritual path taught by Abu Madian's lineage.
And this is Ibn Arabi's massive genius. He was the ultimate synthesizer. He didn't invent these ideas. He was the culmination of centuries of Western intellectual effort. He took the local, metaphysically oriented cosmology of Masarra and Barrajan, the ideas of the cosmic Quran, the perfect man, and he integrated them perfectly with the established ethical and spiritual vocabulary of the Eastern Sufis,
And then he took that integrated philosophy east with him.
and forever changed the global intellectual landscape.
So we've arrived at the end of the line, and today we just call the whole thing Sufism. But if we go back to the source material, the mystics themselves seem reluctant to even use that label.
That's the crucial nuance, and maybe the most important takeaway from this whole deep dive. The term Sufism later became the catch-all umbrella, but when you read the works of these culminating figures, Ibn Arabi, al-Shustari, they rarely referred to themselves just as Sufis.
They use more specialized terms.
They did. They preferred titles like Mokhukun,
The Verifiers.
the verifiers or realizers of truth,
Mhm.
or Orifun, the knowers. They were signaling that their tradition wasn't just about the renunciant practices associated with the earlier, narrower definition of Sufism. Their knowledge was specific. It was a metaphysically rich, contemplatively focused lineage, the direct result of the unique intellectual environment of Al-Andalus.
What an incredible journey. We've managed to trace how the burning of one man's texts in the 10th century led to this secretive parallel tradition that synthesized Neoplatonism, astronomy, and ethical practice. You now have the shortcut to understanding the distinct speculative philosophical edge that Western mysticism brought to the wider world of Islamic thought.
Which all raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider. If the mystics themselves, these monumental figures like Ibn Arabi, preferred to be called verifiers or realizers rather than just Sufis, what does that tell us about the limitations of using broad labels when we discuss highly spiritualized spiritual or intellectual knowledge?
Yeah.
How do we balance necessary categorization with recognizing true complexity in our own learning?
Something profound to mull over as you think about the connections between the universe, scripture, and your own mind through the lens of itibar. That's all for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.